And okay, and I think, let's see, I think we're all set. So our first speaker today will be Corisa Rakestraw from the University of Texas Medical Branch. And our second speaker today will be Sara Jane Melancon of Carroll College in Helena, Montana. And we also have Vera Thomann of the University of Zurich. So let's hear from Corisa first.
All right, let me get this share screen started. All right, is it up on the screen for everybody?
It looks great. You're all set, Corisa.
All right, so thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to share some of my research with you guys. Just like Molly said, my name is Corisa, and I'm a medical humanities PhD candidate at the University of Texas Medical Branch down in sunny Galveston, Texas. And I actually concentrate on healthcare ethics. But today I wanted to discuss how therapy dogs are healers for hospitalized patients, which is part of my larger, currently in progress dissertation. And this topic kind of came to me after being a part of the medical school and teaching medical students, and there's a heavy emphasis placed on being a healer rather than being just a physician. And what that means, how to go above and beyond your trained skills to being a healer. And this is also something that we see happening a lot more across medical schools in the United States. So as a medical humanist, I was really intrigued about this emphasis on being a healer, but I was also left wondering why this term healer is only being given to the professionalized Western healthcare roles, such as physicians, nurses, occupational therapists, and so on. And as a previous therapy dog handler myself, I saw this opportunity to really expand our conception of what a healer is to include animals, with my focus being on therapy dogs. So what I wanted to talk with you guys about today is really to just start with briefly what the human-animal bond is as it manifests for the therapy dogs interacting with hospitalized patients. I then want to kind of briefly detour to talk about what a healing relationship is within the healthcare context and how that human-animal bond transforms into a healing relationship. And then finally, I'll share how the culmination of those threads come together, resulting in how the therapy dog is recognized as a healer. So as I'm sure most of us are aware, dogs have been by our side throughout history. From the ancient Egyptian god Anubis, you see there, who had the jackal head and was the god of mummification and helped weigh the souls on their journey to the afterlife, all the way to the Elizabethan age, where we had spaniel gentles that would literally be prescribed by physicians to help their sick counterparts. And even prominent humanist physician John Caius of the 16th century, even wrote an entire book on dogs. And one section was where he celebrated these spaniel gentles and their willingness to seemingly sacrifice themselves to absorb the illness from their humans that were sick, even if it meant they died. And we also see throughout history, of course, dogs being used with different utility purposes. So whether they were used for hunters or guarding, protecting, even through different religious sacrifices, they always had some sort of role or purpose. But as we shift throughout history into no longer needing dogs for those utility roles, especially like the hunter and gather and protection roles, we really see them taking on a new trajectory of how humans regard dogs. So we see an increase in pet ownership and also that anthropomorphism of dogs. So we see them as family members. We're assigning and understanding them with human qualities and traits, which at the same time seems to be building this sense of solidarity and commonality with them. And we're no longer regarding them as some creature, but rather as our family members, as our beloved four-legged friends. So if we want to start thinking about, okay, this human-animal bond over time, well, what is in a bond? What does this mean? So Fine and Beck, in reflecting on this long history of humankind's relationship with dogs, they propose that there are three aspects to the human-animal bond: attachment, social support, and the theory of biophilia. So attachment is considered to be similar to the parent-child relationship in that it often has some component of protection or a feeling to safeguard another. Social support serves as a source of comfort and as a positive social outlet, especially within difficult times. And biophilia is the desire that humans have to connect with nature and with other living organisms. So together in varying degrees, these three aspects make up a bond, and more specifically, the human-animal bond. So if we were to think about how these three components of the human-animal bond more specifically relate to the bond between a hospitalized patient and a therapy dog, we can see it in these different ways. So regarding attachment, the therapy dog can be said to have providing a sense of familiarity and being an extension of a safety net in this imposing, unfamiliar, sterile hospital. And we often hear this from sentiments of patients saying, this dog reminds me of home. Because home is our safety. That's where we all feel comfortable and safe. And when you're in a hospital room, that goes out the window. So these dogs bring in that sense of security. As a social support, the therapy dog provides comfort, both emotionally and physically, and can meet various social needs of patients, such as interaction, maybe play, love, engagement, and even validation. So that validation comes in with the therapy dogs entering that hospital room and recognizing that there's a person there, there's a human being, not this culmination of symptoms that need to be acted upon, but a living, breathing human. And they're validated for being recognized as such. And then if we think about biophilia as it exists here, we can see that the therapy dog is a direct link to nature within this very unnatural hospital room. So the therapy dog provides that connection to the larger world outside of the patient's window that we as humans are intimately a part of. So they help connect us to the outside world that we simply can't really do within, again, that imposing, sterile hospital environment. So if we want to start thinking about a healing relationship, and it's important that we talk about this within the clinical context that we use in the medical world. So we often think of healing as what I consider to be a journey of understanding, acceptance, and improvement of suffering, and the restoration or return to wholeness. And it's important to note here of suffering. I'm sure we can all imagine that suffering is more than just our physical conditions. So this is both physical suffering, but also emotional suffering, mental suffering, spiritual suffering. All of these things go into things that can be damaged when an illness happens. And so it's important to note that healing also emerged within context and relationships, and that it is inherently a relational process. It's also relational with others, but also with ourselves, with building our own identity and reflecting on ourselves. And some important aspects of a healing relationship, and again, these are not all, but just some, are that it exhibits mindfulness, it has valuable interaction, trust, hope, compassion, and humility. And then finally, borrowing from Miller and Crabtree, healing is a process of being well and becoming together. So it's not a solidarity, you're doing this alone. Again, it exists as a relational process. So if we begin to really think about this and sit on this for a minute, we can see that these things aren't exclusive to human-human relationships. Dogs, cats, horses, llamas, etc., can all help someone on their journey of healing by being that relational source. Maybe they're a source of trust, hope, compassion. They can encourage that being and becoming well together, of restoring that wholeness that someone had before they came into the hospital. So in these ways, the human-animal bond actually transforms into a healing relationship for the hospitalized patients. And in my focus, therapy dogs actually contribute all of these things and can help healing not only happen, but to flourish. So I take this a little bit further. So not only is the human-animal bond a healing relationship, but I go further and suggest that therapy dogs are healers themselves. So what is a healer? So Miller and Cutshall provide an extensive list of all kinds of qualities that exist for a healer. But there are a few that most prominently stand out for me, especially when we're talking about therapy dogs in that role. And those are that a healer listens, they are present, they allow and sit in silence, and touch. Again, these are not all the qualities of healer, but these are some really big ones that therapy dogs can perhaps do even better than maybe humans can do. So what does this look like? So therapy dogs are healers because they listen intently to verbal and nonverbal cues. For many of us who work around dogs or have been around dogs, they are very well attuned to your body language and what you're doing, and they can pick up on things. They're wholly present in the moment. So unlike that physician or nurse who comes in and is maybe worried about there are 15 other patients and someone's going into cardiac arrest or they want their lunch break, so on. The therapy dog is there. They are present. They are not concerned about everything else. They're concerned about the people in front of them or the patient in front of them. Therapy dogs also allow for silence and reflection. The therapy dog's not going to sit there and demand you have a conversation with them about your pain and what number it is on a scale today, or have you give this false reality of how well you're doing. They're going to be okay if you just want to sit there and think. Maybe you want to sit there and cry. So then in this way, therapy dogs can give physical comfort through touch, through hugging and petting, sometimes even little treats or licks, depending on if they can sneak one in. I think we could all agree that it might be a little odd as well if a physician just kind of curls up in a ball in your bed with you as a patient and cuddles with you. Might be a little odd. So patients aren't getting that sense of physical comfort from humans, but we can get it from therapy dogs. And therapy dogs are also a sign of hope. So they can help a patient realize, I may not be able to be a baseball player like I once was, but I can still throw a ball if I use this therapy dog through animal-assisted intervention and learn how to rework the muscles in my arm or in my hand. There's hope that I can still have a life outside of this hospital. And of course, it's also important to talk about the other things that therapy dogs do that are really of main concern for kind of your Western medical team. So therapy dogs, through numerous studies, have also been shown to lower anxiety in patients, decrease patient-reported pain, improve heart rates, and lower those neurohormone levels, so your fight or flight, which of course, these are great things. They help alleviate that physical suffering. But it's those other things before, the listening, the presence, the silence, the touch, the hope, those are the other aspects of healing that therapy dogs cultivate and allow to flourish. So in conclusion here, we can see how the human-animal bond has really paved the way for our contemporary relationship with therapy dogs. And we see how this bond transforms into a healing relationship for patients through those things such as not only relieving suffering, but being a connection to nature, giving hope, comfort, and compassion in ways that medical personnel either can't do or can't do to the same extent. And we can then see how therapy dogs are considered healers as they cultivate and contribute to that healing process for patients. So what does all this do? It really opens the door for us to begin thinking of how we're ascribing and giving out this term healer. And that the way we're doing it right now, by only ascribing healer to humans, actually disregards, undervalues, and denies the interconnectedness of our lives with non-humans. And it actually makes health and healing this human-dependent and human-centric commodity that humans control and dominate, when really health and healing is something we all, humans, non-humans, plant, we all contribute to that. And that's what, when we start to expand our notion of healer and really go against the Western framework as human above all else, we can really see how we can help each other and one another better and all get to that path of healing when we're in our time of need. So that is all I have for you guys. I'm gonna figure out how to stop sharing here. There we go. And I guess, Molly, do we turn over for questions or are we waiting until the end there?
I'm going to throw like one or two at you, I think. Well, first, let me interrupt and say phenomenal job. Even my parrot approves. So thank you so much, Corisa. And we have a few in the chat. I'm going to throw one at you, and then we'll double check the time, and then we'll continue on with Sara Jane. So I personally have a question, and that's with your wonderful attribution of what we see as animal therapy, including animal-assisted activities, as healing. Where would you like to see the research in this intersection of the presence of the animal and healing effect?
Where would I like to see the research? So for me, it's going to exist in kind of those qualitative methods. So really having those interviews with patients, and because right now a lot of the research focuses on, well, what does it do to the body? How is this? What are the medical outcomes? Which again are great, that's part of it, but it's missing those kind of conceptual, theoretical ideas of what people actually feel. So what are their emotions about this? What is their mental state about this? What is their spiritual feeling about this? And that's what seems to be missing, especially in medical literature regarding this, because that's not of concern, because in our Western medical framework, it's all about, well, how can technology fix this? And so where I want to see the research is, let's ask our patients and our healthcare providers, really what's going on. Let's lift this veil and see what's going on behind just the stats that we can get on lab work. Because that's where we really find the good kind of meat and potatoes behind all of this.
Fantastic. I'll pull a couple from the chat. One of the questions here is, Parrot has a question. Do you think acknowledging dogs as healers legally would help to acquire funding for health insurance, for therapy dog training, and also for handlers such as yourself?
It could. So the odd thing is, healer isn't a legal term that we ascribe to people. It's not a professionalized legal term like it would be physician or doctor. So I'm not quite sure how that would work. I think what really needs to happen is kind of like this grassroots acknowledgement within literature of a healer. Now, I would absolutely 100% like to see, and what I hope to do through this dissertation is really change those attitudes that we have with therapy dogs. Of they're more than just this cute little fluffy thing walking down the hall, which they are, don't get me wrong, but they are a valuable contributor to health, but they're more than just something we're using as a means to our end as humans. And we need to recognize that. And through understanding them as healers, what we can start to do is talk about our obligations to using therapy dogs, the ethics involved in it, the protections we need from them. And that's what's missing right now also in the literature is, once we do this elevation, which I think we need to do, we need to see and give appreciation to what these dogs are doing that we can't do as humans. But with that comes a heightened awareness of how we need to protect and our duty to them. And hopefully through that, we can establish more national programs within healthcare institutions of what these programs would look like, and have some, I dare to say professionalization, but some kind of professionalization to where there's a standard, which there are therapy dog organizations in the United States, but a really across the board standardization that handlers and healthcare teams recognize and work off of.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Corisa. You actually even touched on some of the other thoughts that were in the chat, but we'll bring those back when we come back to the big chat. And feel free to peruse those questions too while you're waiting. Sara Jane, would you like to do your presentation?
Yes, I will share my screen.
Excellent.
All right, so my name is Sara Jane Melancon, and I am currently a third-year undergraduate student at Carroll College in Helena, Montana. And last semester in my research methods course, I decided that I wanted to do research about donkeys. And I never imagined that I would end up here, but thank you for allowing me to get here. And the reason that I decided I wanted to look into donkeys is because I work at a equine assisted activities and therapy center in my hometown in Oregon. And something that they do is they have a couple of geriatric donkeys that they occasionally use for donkey assisted psychotherapy. And I wanted to look more into that because that's something that has always really intrigued me. And so I wanted to kind of do a project where I interviewed professionals and really understood the approach of using donkeys in donkey assisted therapy. However, very quickly in my preliminary research, I realized that a lot of the organizations that use donkeys for donkey assisted therapy are kind of touting all of this research about donkey assisted therapy that I wasn't able to find. And so I dug a little bit deeper and I realized that there's a problem. And this problem is what I have begun to call the donkey problem. And that is a severe lack of research about donkeys in the research body about donkeys as a whole. And so I thought, before I can ever venture into a project that looks at donkeys and donkey assisted therapy, I really have to address this donkey problem. So what I decided to do was do a review of the research as it is currently and how it relates to donkeys' use in donkey assisted therapy, and do that through the lens of donkey assisted therapy. So to kind of give you an understanding of what exactly it is that I did and why I really think this is so important, I'm going to read to you my thesis because I think that it does a really great job at explaining this. Despite playing an important role in human history, considerations for the donkey as an independent being are lacking in current research, ultimately serving as a detriment to donkey welfare. In recent years, donkey-assisted therapy has become increasingly popular. And in order to ensure that donkey-assisted therapy is ethical for both the donkey and humans involved, the gaps in current research must be analyzed and addressed in future research. So I mentioned the human side of this, and I'll talk about that briefly throughout my presentation, but for the sake of time, and because I think that the donkeys are really the star of the show, I'm going to be mostly talking about the research that I did on donkeys. So to begin this project, I gathered articles from Carroll College's subscribed to databases and Google Scholar. So ultimately, Google Scholar ended up being the most fruitful source for me, and that's where I spent a lot of my time. And ultimately, for the actual literature review and analysis, I included 16 articles, but I considered a lot and I used a lot of research to inform my project. And my inclusion criteria for including these 16 articles was just that it was the most recent research and the most representative of that body of research within the broader donkey research that I was tuning into. And I know that that sounds like a really broad and vague inclusion criteria. And normally I would agree with you, but because I found the research on donkeys to be so limited, it's really not as vague as you might think. So once I had gathered a lot of articles, I started going through them, and really what I did was just try and find patterns that connected all of the research about donkeys and also find gaps in the research. So this brings me to my first area of research, which ended up being what I would argue to be the most important area of my research and the most informative, is the history of the donkey. So what we know about donkey domestication is that they were first domesticated in ancient Egypt. And in ancient Egypt, they were surprisingly pretty highly revered. And archaeologists have even found donkey skeletons buried in extremely close proximity to pharaohs. So I thought that this was pretty cool and interesting, but upon further investigation, researchers actually found that the skeletons of these donkeys were actually pretty extensively damaged. And specifically, their joints were incredibly damaged and the bones obviously were damaged. And this was from carrying weight that was far too heavy for them. So even in the society where donkeys were revered, they were used and abused for their bodies and revered for what they could do for humans. So we don't have a ton of documentation from Egyptian society as to how they were portrayed, but in ancient Greek literature, in early human history, is when donkeys really started to be documented as having this reputation for being stubborn, lazy, stupid, self-willed. The list can go on. And what we find is the first major pattern, and the pattern that is really the most important throughout all of this research, is that donkeys throughout their entire history have been extensively compared to horses. And this is incredibly problematic because donkeys are an entirely different species from horses with a different number of chromosomes and a very different evolutionary history that really accounts for these differences. That makes the comparison and holding donkeys up to the same standards as horses really just unfair and setting donkeys up for failure. So the next area of research that I found important to look at was the research that we have on general donkey care. And unfortunately, and pretty disappointingly, this was my smallest area of research. So in this section, I found only really 2 articles that I felt were really necessary to include. And ultimately, the conclusion was that all of the guidelines that we have on how to take care of donkeys, how to feed them, how to look after them, is derived from that of horses. Now, when you're looking at donkeys and donkey-assisted therapy, this is particularly problematic. So donkeys have a much slower metabolism than horses. And this is because donkeys evolved to live in a desert-like geographical area where they didn't have a lot of access to resources to begin with. And so what this means for the donkey is that they eat a lot of roughage and they don't require as many calories as a horse. However, their nutritional requirements are proportionally that of a pony or a miniature horse of the same size. And when you're looking at donkeys in donkey-assisted therapy, in the research, they fall under the category of workload for animals used for companion animals. So what that means is they're not doing a ton of manual labor. And what literature cites is that donkeys who are used for primarily for companion animals commonly suffer from ailments such as excess adipose tissue or obesity. And what this means is that if we had information on how to properly care for donkeys, then this likely is something that could be completely bypassed. So this is what really caused me to take a step back and really ask the question, if we don't know how to properly care for donkeys, then is it ethical that we are using them for things like donkey-assisted therapy that are almost solely for human gain? So the next area that I looked at was, what do we have on donkeys in donkey-assisted therapy? What research is there currently? So for this section, I looked at 3 articles. 2 were from Italy and 1 was from the UK. And actually there's a lot of research, not really a lot, but there's significantly more research in Italy, but I did not have access to a lot of it because I was limited to what has been translated into English. But the first one that I looked at was a literature review that was short and concise. And again, it compared horses and donkeys, and it compared hippotherapy to donkey-assisted therapy. And it stated that essentially hippotherapy is a clinically proven treatment modality. The research is there and we can ethically provide therapy for humans using horses, but the research for donkeys isn't there. And so they suggested that we stop using donkeys for donkey-assisted therapy until we have the research body so that we can ethically claim it as therapy for people, and so that we can ensure that the donkeys are being used safely. The next one that I looked at was a pilot study, and it showed really promising results, and it looked at using donkey-assisted therapy for children with a wide array of disabilities. But again, it was a pilot study, and so the numbers were pretty small, and it didn't have a control group, so no broad statements can be made from this study. And the final one that I looked at is a thesis from Michelle Witham-Jones out of the University of Exeter. And what she did was she looked at how donkey-assisted therapy can or can't help children with autism. And her results were also incredibly promising. And something interesting that I found that she tried to do was really be an advocate for the donkey. And while I really think she did a great job at setting the standard for the research in the field, I think there were still some missing areas. So something that I did was I looked through a lot of the reference sections of these papers. And in her paper, I found that there wasn't much donkey specific research in the paper at all. And that really indicated to me as I was going through with this, that this is a real problem that is plaguing the field. And this is something that needs to be focused on, because even in the state of the art research, we don't have the information about donkeys that we really need. So this brings me to the final area of research that I looked at, and this is the ethical considerations that I feel need to be made, and a lot of scientists also feel need to be made about donkeys. And in this area, I found 5 studies, and they were all pretty congruent with each other, and agreed on a lot of the things that need to happen to address these issues. So the first need that was established is the need to dismantle the stereotypes that have followed donkeys throughout their domestication process. And these are the stereotypes that still exist in the research today and that were created way back in Greek society. The second thing that became really evident and apparent is the need to consider both the physical and emotional health of the donkeys. I addressed the physical health earlier when I talked about the general care of donkeys, but the emotional health is arguably equally as important. So this really also ties into the next point about having scales that can assess the donkey's fitness for the job. And that's really what's going to be able to measure all of these things, is some standardized scales that we can use to reliably measure the physical and emotional health, and therefore the fitness for the job. If you think about it, we're expecting donkeys to step into a therapeutic role. And for any species, this is an incredibly taxing job. We don't expect every single human on this planet to be able to conduct therapy. So we shouldn't expect the same from these animals that we're asking to participate in therapy. So the final thing that this brings me to is the discussion and conclusion. So ultimately, what I was able to gather was that these labels that donkeys have carried for so long are incredibly dangerous and have been a real detriment to the species as a whole. Donkeys are sentient beings, and that is something that has really been lost throughout their history. And we need to take a step back and really honor that so that we can ensure that everything we are doing is ethical. And finally, donkey-assisted therapy definitely has the potential to be validated. We just need to take a step back and slow down and really ensure that we are looking after the welfare of the donkeys first and foremost, since this is a service they're doing for us. Donkeys are incredibly useful to us humans, but I really feel it's time that we start asking, how can we be useful to them? And donkeys really deserve that. So thank you. That's all I have.
Fantastic job, Sarah. Thank you so much. Let's see. So we have a few questions. I'm going to be selfish and use mine first. Why don't you go ahead and take the screen share down just so we can see you a little better. Perfect. Thank you. So selfishly, my question is, so with all of your research and now that you are aware of this problem, how do you feel when you see donkeys presently being used in animal-assisted therapies?
I have pretty mixed feelings about it. So obviously the facility that I work at uses donkeys for these services, and they work really hard to ensure that these donkeys have the best care possible, and the donkeys are really thriving. So it's hard for me to say as a blanket statement, stop using donkeys, when I do think there are ethical ways to do it. But I think as a whole, if you're claiming it as therapy, I think there's an ethical problem, because the research simply isn't there. And it's an ethical problem because if you're going to be billing insurance and having people pay for these services, then they deserve to have it be a well-researched clinical modality. However, I do think that there are benefits to using donkeys, and those benefits have been realized to a certain degree in the research. And so I think it just is an issue of language and ensuring that even though we don't have a ton of research about how to properly care for donkeys, that we're doing everything possible with what we have to ensure that they are being treated fairly and humanely.
Excellent. And that actually plays a second question, which is what do you think we can do to ensure or to at least even evaluate how this benefits the donkey?
I think that really what needs to happen is that we need to develop an understanding for certain verified markers as to ensure that these donkeys are being appropriately mentally stimulated and taken care of, and that there's some way outside of the opinion aspect of, oh, my donkey's well taken care of, look at it, that we can really use to measure donkey welfare, if that makes sense.
Very good. And I think we had one more in there, which was in your research, if you touched on any popular media resources or just have seen any, what is the accuracy of the information, if you know, that is pet or companion or agricultural based about donkeys versus the academic information?
So I really haven't seen a ton of stuff out there about donkeys. So a lot of what I saw in the media was it's a lot of it is more horse focused, and a lot of what I saw was people kind of tend to just include donkeys into the category of equines, and just because this is true for horses, they decide this is true for donkeys. And that became pretty clear in some of the research that I looked at, but then also on a lot of the websites of donkey assisted therapy programs around the world that I looked into. They claimed a lot of researched benefits that really kind of seemed like and felt like they were pulling that information from the equine research and transferring it over to donkeys. Because it seemed like there was something there, but it didn't seem like it was actually about donkeys.
No, excellent, super helpful. Awesome job, Sarah. Anybody who has additional questions, let's save those for the very end. But thank you, they're excellent questions. So thank you again, Sarah. That was a great talk. And Vera, would you like to get started?
Yes, let me just share my screen.
Yep, take your time getting yourself set up.
Okay, can you hear and see me?
Yep, you're perfect. Go right ahead.
Great. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. My name is Vera and I am a PhD student at the University of Zurich. I am working on an interdisciplinary research project interested in the relations between researchers, animal caretakers and lab animals at the University of Zurich. In what follows, I will be talking about the research field, my research questions and methods, some exemplary findings and preliminary hypotheses, and I will be ending with some prospects of the project. Please be aware that the data is not completely evaluated up to this point, as I am in the midst of field work. My research project is called Human-Animal Relations in Scientific Animal Experiments at the University of Zurich, and it is funded by the Vice President of Research of the university. The project aims to analyze how scientific competitiveness, hierarchical institutional organization, political developments and activism regarding animal welfare, as well as emotions towards lab animals produce ambivalences in human-animal relations within research environments. The project is consciously based on an animal-oriented perspective, focusing on animal agency within the experiments, co-working processes, emotions towards the animals, and the transparency of communication. As you may think, the project relies heavily on human-animal studies, science and technology studies, as well as interaction studies. This perspective allows to derive argumentative links between processes in which the relation with the lab animals does not seem to be involved or does not seem to be very important. But as I will try to present today to you, it exerts a certain influence on the scientific and experimental culture without it being taken into account institutionally or structurally. So my research field includes human actors that work within the 3 faculties that conduct animal experiments at the University of Zurich. So we have the Faculty of Mathematics and Natural Sciences, there is the Faculty of Medicine, and then there is the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine. It includes research teams in which several team members from different employment relationships are in contact with the respective animals. So, for example, research leaders, PhD students, postdocs, or animal caretakers. The research field also includes a very wide range of non-human actors. In 2018, to give you some numbers, the University of Zurich used 75,421 animals for animal experiments, most of them being mice, rats, and pigs. However, my research field is not limited by these main species of animals, and especially not by whether the animals are legally protected in the animal experiments. So the lab animals that are part of my project range from insects, birds,
I've
fish,
got the Zoom.
Mice,
Having both headphones on.
And rats to big mammals such as sheep, pigs, and monkeys. The practices regarding the animal experiments range from individual practices, collective practices regarding research teams, faculty-specific practices, and institutional ones. A specific interest of the research project lies in the institutional practices, which means the overarching practices that include, for example, infrastructure, education, and labor division within the university. Additionally, the project thus touches many political, theoretical, and social discourses, such as the comprehension of lab animals as subjects, or the idea of agency within the experiments. Then on the other hand, the lab animal as an epistemic thing, thought with Hans-Jörg Reinberger. Then scientific progress and competitiveness in universities or in institutions that are similar to universities. Then a very hierarchical division of labor that relates back to the university structure, rationality and emotions towards animal and in science, as well as, of course, animal ethics and animal suffering. Methodically, I work with qualitative guided interviews that I conduct with 15 research groups from all of the 3 faculties. Within these different research groups, team members from different employment relationships are being interviewed, so research leaders, PhD students, and animal caretakers. In the best case, it's been 4 to 5 people from the respective teams. And when choosing the research groups, I am being careful of including lab animals that allow comparisons throughout the different faculties. So, for example, I am choosing different teams that work with mice. So I have a couple of teams from all the different faculties. The overarching question of the qualitative research project is how contact persons of lab animals assess and describe the relationships between humans and animals in animal experimentations. It is of special interest which ambivalences and ambiguities are implicitly and explicitly expressed in the description of these relations, due to the highly complex system of interlocking hierarchies. Additionally, it is of interest which institutional structures and hierarchies determine the relationships to lab animals in animal experiments. So the focus is to identify the structures that are relevant for the emergence and maintenance of these ambivalences. I am now going to present to you a few of the exemplary findings of the study. A first finding is that the relationship with lab animals is very much person dependent and not conditioned by the particular species, which means that relations with insects, with fish or small mammals are as probable as relations with bigger mammals. Likewise, the relationship does not depend on the specific position within the research group or the research field. This is of interest, I think, because relationships or relations are generally thought to be more easily possible with bigger mammals or in certain research fields, such as veterinary medicine or ethology. Finding number 2 is that the majority of the researchers stated that a closer relationship between humans and animals is productive for their research. Reasons include that one can better assess the animal, that one causes less stress to the animal, that one uses fewer animals, and that the validity of the scientific work also benefits from having better knowledge about the behavior and the handling of the animals. These statements stand in contrast to factors such as the involvement of animal caretakers in the research work, communication about emotions, as well as distance, which I will come to now. Finding number 3 is that on the one hand, all of the animal caretakers interviewed stated that they were in contact with the lab animals the most. On the other hand, animal caretakers are mostly not included in the planning of research projects or have no insight in the project planning at all. It can also be seen that the animal caretakers are sometimes spatially very much separated from the research teams. For example, that there is a strictly separated division of labor in which the researchers have less and less contact with the animals. This is related to a research culture insofar as animal caretakers are mostly, or in most cases, not part of publications or have a share in analytical processes, at least here in Switzerland. And additionally, there is an asymmetry in power relations due to different educations. Finding number 4 is that all of the researchers interviewed stated to have some kind of personal boundaries in working with lab animals or practices of animal experimentation. Reference was generally made to animals that are just outside of one's own practice, species-wise, that is. The researchers working with large mammals, for example, refer to monkeys as animals that they could not work with. The researchers in the mouse and rat groups refer to larger mammals, such as dogs, while the researchers in the fish group, for example, refer to mice and rats. Finding number 5 is that emotions towards lab animals are mostly talked about only in private, which means non-institutionalized contexts. So forms of emotional distancing influence, for example, the labeling of animals with numbers and not with names. And the topic most named in the context of dealing with emotions is the death or the killing of the lab animals. This relates to finding number 6. With the death of the animal, a division of labor becomes apparent. The greater the spatial and emotional distance between the researchers and the animals, the more the killing of the lab animals usually falls to the animal caretakers as a task. I am going to quickly show you how I work with code relations models. Please excuse that the codes are in German because I am working in German and with German interviews. But what I would like to show you is that I work with a program called MaxQDA, where you can code certain topics or sentences and then look at which overlapping codes exist within the different interviews. So what I have been working with is, for example, the overlapping code that goes with distance. And the most overlapping codes are the death of the animal, the emotions, human-animal relations, the labeling of animals, and teamwork. And for this specific code relations model, I will in what follows, try to come up with some preliminary hypotheses of the project. So with the help of the code relations model, I am deducing the following preliminary hypotheses with which I am working now, amongst other things. So emotions towards lab animals are mostly exclusively discussed in private and non-institutionalized contexts, although researchers generally consider a close relationship between humans and animals to be productive for their work. Likewise, forms of emotional distancing influence the handling of lab animals and an animal contact avoiding division of labor that relies heavily on the hierarchical structures of the university. Therefore, emotions and distance shape institutional processes and developments that, from the outside perspective, may have or may seem to have little to do with the lab animals and the relations with the lab animals. An animal-oriented perspective allows to derive argumentative links between processes in which the relation to the experimental animal seems not to be involved. So emotional distancing also has an effect on processes and spatial procedures, such as the labeling of the lab animals. And if the maintenance of distance thus arrives from emotional motives in dealing with the animals and affects work processes and forms, the question arises as to why emotions in dealing with the animals are not addressed publicly and institutionally in the context of cooperation. To sum up, I would like to make some points to the prospects of this project. The prospects of my project are mainly ones that allow to think about the development of institutional changes and developments in regards to the human-animal relationships in research environments such as the University of Zurich. By integrating human-animal relations in common institutional development activities, such as the optimization of labor division and cooperation, spatiality and the planning of projects, I think, or I would like to discuss with you, it would be possible to not only include animal welfare and the 3 R's, replacement, reduction and refinement of animals in animal experiments as factors throughout the proceedings of the experiments or in education, but to adapt the planning and institutional procedures to integrate animal caretakers more thoroughly and to work against distancing processes that rest on hierarchical structures. This is more of a sketch while being in the middle of field work, so I am excited for your questions and the discussion. Thank you so much for your attention.
Lovely job, Vera. Thank you so much. So I have a bunch of questions. We'll start with, actually, I'm going to take one from Tom, which is, based on your experience and how, close individuals are with their subjects, did you see elements of guilt present? And if so, how did your subject express that guilt?
Guilt is very much present when talking to the researchers. I think also because it's a very political and a very, how to say, a topic that is very much discussed, and people know that it's a difficult topic to talk about. But what I find is very interesting is that people develop strategies to work around this guilt or to work with this guilt. For example, in saying goodbye to the animals, or in having some kind of theory how this serves a good purpose, for example, scientific progress.
Very good. And how do you find that researchers distance themselves? Do they seem to distance themselves as they proceed through their career? Or do you see, that distancing basically established in the same distance throughout their career?
Researchers describe, in this project at least, 2 different developments throughout their careers. One is that they kind of start their research and have difficulties working with the animals, and then they get used to it. That is the one direction. And the other one is that some people state that they become more sensible to animal welfare and animal care throughout their careers. So there is kind of these 2 different developments.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Vera. This has been great. Why don't we'll stop, I believe we'll stop the general recording now, and then we'll